Dr. Teddy Willsey here. Today we're going to talk about the hamstring conundrum, and this applies to most of field and court athletes. So the statistics say that between 8 and 25% of athletes will have a hamstring injury during their playing career. For the purposes of this talk, we're going to limit it to 3 main points that we're going to discuss. Number 1 is going to be core and postural control, and we're looking at anterior tilt and how that relates to hamstring injuries. There's a lot of people out there in a specific school of thought that talk about when we get into this more anterior tilted position, it's going to lengthen the hamstrings. Whether that's true or not, we don't quite know, but we do understand that when we're in that position all the time, it can create feelings of tightness and neural tension in the hamstrings and posterior chain. So we want to address that through some core stability and core control exercises, some gentle setting while increasing tension in the hamstrings. The second aspect that we're going to cover today is eccentrics. Now, most of us know that eccentrics play a big part in preventing injury. We live in an eccentric deficit. So what that means is every time we jump, our eccentric contraction has to catch up to us to stop that force. Now, if our eccentric contraction is not strong or fast enough, that's when we start to have soft tissue injuries and even bigger injuries like ACL, ligamentous, that sort of thing. So we're going to go over some good eccentric exercises for the hamstring, and there's a couple kind of unique ones that I like to do on the slide board. The third aspect that we're going to talk about with hamstrings today is the gait cycle. I'm going to address how we want to use the gait cycle to our advantage when we're coming back from hamstring injuries, and also how you can address this in your training to just make sure that your athletes are getting a full hip drive, knee drive cycle through and not kind of relying on an overstride position to get their speed. The first thing I want to address today is our hip hinging pattern, and we're going to take this one step back into a bridge. Now, we know that when our athletes are doing an RDL or any sort of deadlift variation, we want them to hinge through the hips and lengthen the hamstrings. We want to try to avoid or mitigate the amount of movement that they're getting through the lumbar spine. Now, research tells us that no matter how much we think we're maintaining a neutral spine, the reality is we are not, and that holds true for elite lifters as well as more of our amateur lifters and our kind of young 20s athletes that are athletes first and lifters second. They are definitely not going to be able to maintain something close to a neutral spine just due to their novice lifting experience. So the first thing we're going to look at today is the bridge variation or the bridge pattern. And just starting with a very normal bridge, I want to make sure that my athletes' ribs are staying down and they're not pushing through their low back and their lumbar extensors to get up. So starting in this bridge position, first thing we're going to do is teach them to feel this anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. Ideally, we would have already taught the posterior pelvic tilt through some back exercises and things like the dead bug or even just a hollow body hold. So once we've kind of established that posterior tilt and they have the kinesthetic awareness to know where that is, next we're going to bridge up. So I'm posteriorly tilting, my low back is pushed into the ground. From there, I'm bridging, driving through the hips, squeezing my glutes at the top. Now, another thing to consider with our spinal extension patterns is that it's global. And so what this means is that we want to pay attention to our chin position, our head position, our eye position, and everything from the top down. However, we know that we cannot cue our athletes on a million different things at once. That's just not reasonable. So let's choose one thing. For this, we'll say chin down, forward gaze. All right, that's going to get them out of that global extension pattern and help them to maintain more flexion. When we get more spinal flexion, that's going to then facilitate hip extension through the glutes.